It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when the Matthews family walked into Bella's Bistro, a cozy local restaurant in the heart of the small town. The smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling burgers filled the air as they entered. Tasha Matthews, a mother of two, glanced at the menu board overhead. Her children, Jamal and Mia, eagerly followed behind, scanning the selection. "We'll take a seat by the window, Mom," Jamal said, his eyes bright with excitement. Tasha smiled and nodded, her mind already thinking about the stress of the week that was finally behind her. This was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, just a simple meal out. Nothing special. They'd been coming to Bella's for years, always treated kindly by the staff. Tasha didn't expect anything out of the ordinary today, but today would be different. As they entered the dining area, the waitress, a woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and a stiff demeanor, glanced up from behind the counter. Her name tag read, Samantha. Tasha led her kids to a table by the window, but the waitress's eyes narrowed as they sat down. The warmth of the restaurant suddenly felt cold. Samantha approached the table, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Excuse me, but this section is for paying customers only," Samantha said, her voice laced with irritation. Tasha blinked, confused. "We're here to eat, ma'am. We're going to order." Samantha's eyes flickered over the family, her expression tightening. "We don't serve people like you here," she said bluntly. Tasha's stomach dropped. She had heard of racism in other places, but never here. Not at Bella's, not in her town. She tried to keep her voice calm, but the words didn't come easy. "Excuse me?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling. The waitress crossed her arms. "I said, you need to leave. Now." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at her children, whose faces were now filled with confusion and growing discomfort. Jamal, always outspoken, opened his mouth to protest, but Tasha quickly placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. "Mom, what's going on?" Mia asked, her small voice barely a whisper. The waitress, Samantha, didn't give them a chance to respond. With a quick glance around the restaurant, she snapped her fingers. "I said out," she repeated, her tone icy, as if the family's very presence had become a personal affront. "Is this some kind of joke?" Tasha asked, trying to keep her voice steady but failing. "We've been coming here for years. You've served us before." Samantha's eyes flickered with annoyance, then she turned away, scanning the restaurant as if to make sure no one was witnessing her actions. "This is a private establishment. I don't have time for this," Samantha said, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. Tasha stood up, her voice now rising, but before she could say another word, the door to the kitchen swung open, and the restaurant manager, Mr. Stevens, stepped out. His eyes widened in confusion when he saw Tasha standing by the window, her family still seated. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze shifting from the waitress to the Matthews family. Samantha quickly spoke up, her words rushing out in an attempt to explain. "They're just sitting here trying to take up space without ordering. I asked them to leave." Mr. Stevens looked confused. "What do you mean, take up space? They've been regular customers here for years." Tasha's frustration flared. "That's what I've been saying. We're here to eat, like we always do. She's the one causing the problem." The manager hesitated, then turned his gaze to the Matthews family. His eyes softened with recognition, but he still looked puzzled. "I'll handle this," he said, dismissing Samantha with a short wave. "You're welcome to stay, ma'am. I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." But the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, and Tasha could feel the heat of humiliation rising in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if the manager truly understood or if he was simply trying to smooth things over. As they sat back down, Jamal looked at his mother, his eyes wide. "Why did she do that, Mom? What did we do wrong?" Tasha shook her head, her throat tight. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that things had changed. As the Matthews family quietly settled back into their booth, the air around them felt heavy. Tasha could feel the weight of the earlier confrontation pressing on her chest. She tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the menu in front of her, but the sting of Samantha's words kept echoing in her mind. Jamal, still looking unsettled, leaned forward. "I don't get it, Mom. We've eaten here 1,000,000 times. Why would she say something like that?" Tasha bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. "I don't know, baby. Some people, they're just not nice. It's not our fault, and it's not your fault either. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." She could feel Mia's small hand in hers, gripping it tightly, and she wished she could give them an explanation that made sense. But the truth was, there wasn't one. She had no idea why they'd been singled out, no idea why someone would treat them like that just because of the color of their skin. The minutes stretched on in silence. The bistro, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign. The hum of conversations around them seemed louder, more oppressive. Tasha didn't want to be here anymore, but she refused to let that woman's hatred win. She'd stay, if only to show her children that they could face this kind of treatment with dignity. Just then, the sound of the doorbell chimed as a new group of customers entered the restaurant. They were all smiles, talking animatedly as they took a seat at the opposite end of the room. The woman who entered first had a sharp business suit on, and Tasha could see the glint of authority in her walk. She couldn't help but notice how she looked around the room, sizing up the place like she owned it. The woman's eyes briefly landed on the Matthews family, but she quickly moved to the hostess desk, where Mr. Stevens greeted her with a wide smile. Tasha, distracted, tried not to overhear their conversation, but a few words caught her attention. "You must be excited. I know the transition's been a lot," Mr. Stevens said. The woman smiled. "I'm just happy it's finally official. I've got big plans for Bella's. Don't worry, we'll take good care of it." Tasha's ears perked up. Big plans for Bella's? Was she the new owner? Before she could fully process the idea, a few seconds later, Mr. Stevens excused himself and walked briskly toward the kitchen. The woman sat down, pulled out a tablet, and started typing something. Tasha leaned in, looking at the woman more closely. She didn't recognize her, but there was something about her presence that made the room feel different, like a shift was coming, whether people were ready for it or not. She turned her attention back to her family, trying to ignore the thoughts swirling in her head. That woman, whoever she was part of something bigger than just the bistro. But what could that connection possibly mean for the Matthews family? And what would happen when the waitress Samantha realized the truth? The atmosphere in Bella's bistro shifted as the minutes ticked by. Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The restaurant had always been a place of comfort for their family, a place where they could sit and enjoy a meal without worrying about stares or whispers. But now, that safe haven seemed distant, like a memory slipping through her fingers. Jamal was still quiet, staring down at his menu without really reading it. Mia had stopped fidgeting, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, sensing the tension in the air. It wasn't the loud, obvious kind of tension. No, this was subtle, a quiet undercurrent of something waiting to break. Then, the door opened again. Tasha glanced up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Mr. Stevens walk back into the room, followed closely by the woman in the business suit. The woman, who Tasha had guessed was the new owner, walked toward the hostess stand with a purpose. She looked around the room, and her gaze landed on Tasha's family for a moment. A slight pause. Then, she continued on, directing Mr. Stevens to another table where a couple sat waiting for their drinks. But Tasha's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but feel like this new owner was connected to something much bigger than she could see, something that might change everything, not just for Bella's bistro, but for her family too. She wasn't sure how, but she felt it. A few minutes later, the waitress, Samantha, returned. She avoided eye contact with Tasha and her family, instead focusing on cleaning tables near the back. Tasha took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew it was time to find out. Slowly, she stood up, her legs a little shaky from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Mom, where are you going?" Jamal asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Tasha smiled at her son, trying to reassure him. "I'll be right back. Just stay here for a moment, okay? Jamal nodded, though he still looked concerned. Tasha's heart ached at the sight of her children, innocent and confused, and she longed to protect them from the ugliness of the world. As Tasha walked towards the front, she could feel the eyes of the restaurant on her. She could sense the whispers beginning to bubble up again, but this time, it didn't matter. She was determined to speak up. She made her way toward the hostess stand, where the new owner stood, arranging some papers. The moment she reached the stand, the woman's eyes locked with hers. A knowing look passed between them. "Excuse me," Tasha said, her voice steady. "Are you the new owner of this restaurant?" The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question, but she nodded. "Yes, I'm Grace Blackwell. It's a pleasure to meet you." Tasha took a deep breath. "I'm Tasha Matthews, and I've been a regular here for years. I just wanted to let you know about what happened earlier with your waitress, Samantha. She kicked my family out, just because we were sitting here." Grace blinked in surprise. "I'm so sorry to hear that. That's completely unacceptable. I will have a word with her." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "It's not just about one incident. It's about what's been happening here for years. The way people like my family are treated, like we don't belong." Grace looked down for a moment, as if considering Tasha's words. When she spoke again, her tone was more serious. "I understand, and I want to assure you that things are going to change here. This restaurant is under new ownership now, and I won't tolerate that kind of behavior. I'm going to make sure this place is welcoming to everyone, no matter who they are." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she believed her just yet, but she felt a flicker of hope. Change. That's what she needed to hear. "I appreciate that," Tasha said, her voice softer now. "I just want my kids to feel like they're safe, like they belong." Grace smiled gently. "I promise you, this will be a place where everyone belongs." Tasha felt a small weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of possibility, a chance for real change. As she turned to head back to her family, she couldn't help but glance at Samantha, who was now nervously wiping down a table at the far end of the restaurant. She had no idea what was coming for her. Tasha returned to her table, her mind still racing. She sat down quietly, taking in the silence that had settled over their little corner of the restaurant. Jamal was still staring at the menu, his fingers nervously tapping on the table. Mia was looking out the window, her small hands folded in her lap. "Mom, who was that lady?" Jamal finally asked, breaking the quiet. "The one in the suit?" Tasha smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's the new owner. Her name is Grace Blackwell." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "So she's like the boss now?" "Yeah," Tasha said, nodding. "And she's going to make sure things change around here. She doesn't want anyone treated like we were earlier." Mia looked up at her mother, confusion clouding her young face. "But why did that lady say those things to us? Why did she make us leave?" Tasha's heart broke for her daughter. How could she explain such cruelty to a child so young? Mia didn't understand what it meant to be treated differently because of the color of her skin. Not yet, at least. Some people aren't as kind as they should be," Tasha said softly, trying to find the right words. "But not everyone is like that. Some people want to make things better, and that's what I hope will happen here." Jamal nodded slowly, though he still looked uncertain. He'd been through too many situations like this to believe it could be that simple. As they sat in silence, the tension in the room seemed to rise again. Tasha could feel it. It was a feeling she'd gotten used to over the years, a sense of discomfort that lingered in spaces like this. But today, something was different. Grace's promise of change lingered in the air like a faint hope, a hope that was about to be tested. A few moments later, Samantha appeared at their table. She was carrying a small tray of drinks, 3 glasses of water, and her hands were shaking ever so slightly. She placed the glasses down in front of them, avoiding eye contact with Tasha. Tasha felt her chest tighten, but she didn't want to back down. This wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about standing up for the respect they all deserved. Samantha finally looked up at Tasha, her expression unreadable. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but paused. "Are you going to apologize?" Tasha asked, her voice calm but firm. Samantha blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" "For what you did earlier," Tasha clarified, her gaze unwavering. "You kicked us out just because we were sitting here." Samantha opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Her face flushed red, and she looked like she might burst into tears. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to step in and intervene, but no one did. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. I didn't mean," Samantha started, but her voice trailed off. I didn't know you were, I didn't know who you were." Tasha's jaw clenched, but she held her ground. "It doesn't matter who we are. It's the fact that you treated us like we didn't belong here, like we weren't worthy of a meal." Samantha swallowed hard, her eyes flickering to the ground. "I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt you." Tasha nodded slowly, her expression still firm. "Sorry doesn't fix this, but maybe it's a start." The awkward silence hung between them for a moment, thick and uncomfortable. Tasha could see the regret in Samantha's eyes, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of what had happened. Just as Tasha was about to speak again, Grace appeared at the table. She had been watching from a distance, and now she walked over, her expression serious. "Samantha," Grace said, her voice carrying authority, "I need to speak with you. Now." Samantha's eyes widened in panic, but she nodded, stepping away from the table. As she followed Grace to the back of the restaurant, Tasha couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a step in the right direction. Jamal and Mia looked at their mother, both waiting for some sign of what was going to happen next. Tasha smiled, though it was a tired smile, one that didn't have all the answers. "I think things are going to change, kids," she said softly, though her heart was still heavy with the uncertainty of it all. "But it's up to us to make sure that change happens." The moment felt bittersweet. There was hope, but also the realization that real change would take time, and not just in this restaurant, but in the world outside it. The restaurant had quieted, but the tension was palpable. Samantha had disappeared with Grace, and Tasha, Jamal, and Mia sat at their table waiting in silence. The once lively hum of conversation was now replaced with hushed whispers. It was as though everyone knew something important was unfolding, but no one wanted to be the first to speak out of turn. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Do you think Grace will really do something about it?" he asked. His voice was low, almost like he wasn't sure if he even believed his own question. Tasha glanced at him, then at Mia, who was staring out the window, her small face filled with curiosity. She could sense the weight of the situation, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. "I think she will," Tasha replied, though her voice lacked the certainty she wished she could convey. She seemed like she cared about making things right. "But what if it doesn't change? What if it's just another fake apology and nothing happens?" Jamal pressed, his eyes intense with the concern he'd carried for years. He'd seen enough of these situations to know that promises didn't always turn into action. Tasha reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's why we have to keep pushing. Change doesn't come easily, Jamal. We have to hold people accountable, every single time." Jamal nodded, though there was still a cloud of doubt in his eyes. He was a smart kid, perceptive in ways that made Tasha both proud and fearful. He'd learned far too much about the world's injustices at a young age, and she could see the battle he was fighting within himself. Before she could say anything else, Grace returned to their table. Her face was a little flushed, but she stood taller now, a sense of purpose in her posture. Samantha, still clearly shaken, followed her, her eyes avoiding Tasha's gaze. "I've spoken with Samantha," Grace began, addressing the room in a calm but firm tone. "And we've come to an understanding." She glanced briefly at the waitress, who nodded, her face still red with embarrassment. "She'll be reassigned to other duties while we assess her future here." Tasha's eyes narrowed. She had hoped for more, but at least this was a start. "And what about the other staff?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "What about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place?" Grace nodded, understanding the gravity of the question. "That's exactly why I'm here. This restaurant is about to undergo some serious changes. This isn't just about one employee. It's about how we treat every customer who walks through that door, no matter their background." Jamal glanced up at Grace, a slight spark of hope in his eyes. "You mean it?" "I do," Grace confirmed, "and it starts with me. I'll be having a meeting with all the staff tomorrow, making it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. We're going to rebuild trust, and that means confronting the hard truths." Tasha couldn't help but feel a shift in the atmosphere. There was still a long road ahead, but hearing Grace speak with such determination reminded her of the potential for real change. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but for the first time she saw the possibility of something better. The conversation was interrupted when the kitchen door swung open, and the chef appeared, a smile on his face as he approached their table. He placed a fresh plate of food in front of them, an offering that felt symbolic of the changes underway. "We've made a few adjustments to the menu," the chef said with a wink, "and I think you'll like what you see." Tasha's smile softened as she looked down at the plates of food. It was simple, but it was a gesture that spoke volumes. This restaurant might be starting fresh, just like the meal in front of her. A new beginning, one that came with its challenges, but also with the promise of progress. Samantha stood awkwardly off to the side, still not meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm sorry," she said once more, her voice quieter than before. "I wasn't thinking, and I treated you wrong." Tasha looked up at her, and for the first time she saw the sincerity in the apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Thank you," she replied simply. There was still work to be done, but this moment felt like a small victory. Change was never easy, and it often came with discomfort and conflict. But it was also what made moments like this so significant. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the acknowledgement of the wrong and the steps taken to make it right. As they sat there, eating their meal and talking about the future, the world outside the restaurant continued its own march forward. But for Tasha and her family, the ripples of change they'd started would be felt far beyond the walls of this small dining room. The battle wasn't over, but it had begun. The following day, the restaurant buzzed with a new energy. Staff members were gathered in the back room, facing Grace as she stood before them, her arms crossed, her eyes focused on the task at hand. The air was thick with anticipation. No one had spoken about what had happened the day before, but everyone knew it was time for things to change. They could all feel the shift, like the calm before a storm, or perhaps a new beginning. Samantha was there too, her eyes downcast, standing off to the side, her body language reflecting the weight of the previous day's events. She wasn't sure if she was forgiven yet, but the fact that she was still there meant something. She'd been given a chance. She only hoped she wouldn't squander it. Grace cleared her throat, her voice calm but firm. "I've called this meeting for a reason, and that reason is simple. This restaurant is going through a transformation. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, and it goes against everything we stand for as a team and as a business. But it's not just Samantha who needs to reflect on their actions. We all do." The room was silent, the gravity of her words settling on everyone like a heavy blanket. Grace had the floor now, and she wasn't letting go. She continued, "I know we've all been comfortable in our roles, in our routines, but comfort can breed complacency. And complacency is what allows attitudes like what we saw yesterday to fester. So we're going to be doing things differently from now on." Tasha, sitting in the corner with Jamal and Mia, exchanged a look with her family. They had witnessed the events of the previous day, but now, seeing Grace take charge, they could feel a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the same restaurant it had been. This wasn't the same community. Grace paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment longer before saying, "We will be introducing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff members starting next week. We'll also be revisiting our customer service policies, making it clear that respect isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement for everyone." Samantha's head lifted slightly, a flicker of realization passing over her face. She wasn't just facing consequences, she was being given an opportunity to be better, to truly change. But change wasn't just about her. It was about the entire team, the entire community. It was about unlearning the biases that had taken root in this place over time and actively choosing to become something better. Grace continued, her tone unwavering. "We have a long road ahead, but I promise you, if you're not willing to respect every person who walks through that door, then this isn't the place for you. We're going to build something that everyone can be proud of. If that means we have to let go of the past, so be it." The room remained still, but this time there was a sense of understanding. Samantha, standing quietly among her colleagues, looked at the floor, then back up at Grace. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her, but instead of judgment, she felt something else, a sense of possibility. The following weeks passed by in a whirlwind of change. Samantha, like many of her colleagues, found herself unlearning habits and assumptions she hadn't even realized she had. It wasn't easy. Every day she confronted her biases head-on, sometimes with discomfort, but it was necessary. She could see the difference in how people interacted with each other now, both in and outside of the restaurant. The mandatory training sessions were eye-opening for many. They weren't just about tolerance or diversity in the workplace. They were about empathy, understanding, and shared responsibility. Grace made it clear that change wasn't a quick fix, and it would take time. But the more they worked together, the more they began to feel like a true team, rather than just a group of employees in a restaurant. Samantha was particularly affected by one of the sessions, which focused on understanding microaggressions and their impact. She thought back to her actions the day the Black family had been kicked out. She'd seen them as other, as outsiders, but that was not who they were. They were patrons, just like anyone else. What she had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of how deep-rooted bias could be, even in someone who thought they were open-minded. The guilt she felt was heavy, but it also pushed her to keep going, to do better. The day came when the family returned. It was a slow afternoon when Grace noticed the same family walking through the door. Jamal, Tasha, and Mia walked in, this time with smiles on their faces. They were warmly greeted by the hostess and led to a table. The restaurant had changed. Grace was sure of it. And just as importantly, the family was sure of it too. When they were seated, Grace couldn't resist walking over to them. She made sure the other staff members were watching. She wanted them to see that this wasn't just about one person. It was about the entire place. "Welcome back," Grace said, smiling warmly at them. Jamal, surprised by the greeting, nodded in return. "Thanks. It's good to be back." Grace's eyes shifted to Samantha, who was standing nearby. Samantha swallowed, taking a deep breath before walking over. "Hi," Samantha began, her voice tentative. "I just wanted to personally apologize for the way I treated you all last time. It was wrong, and I've been working hard to understand my actions." Jamal looked at her, and for a moment, there was a silence. Then, a soft smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "We appreciate that," he said, his tone kind. "It means a lot to hear you say that." Samantha nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The weight she had carried for weeks suddenly felt lighter. Grace, watching the interaction, felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't just about one apology. It was about creating an environment where people could openly acknowledge mistakes, learn from them, and grow. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the weeks went on, the changes within the restaurant became more evident. The staff had grown closer, working as a cohesive unit, rather than a group of individuals simply clocking in for a paycheck. The mandatory diversity training had opened their eyes to the ways they could all be better, not just in their professional roles, but in their personal lives as well. Conversations shifted from the usual small talk to deeper discussions about privilege, respect, and the importance of community. Samantha had earned back the trust of her colleagues, and more importantly, her own self-respect. She knew that the path to redemption wasn't a straight line. It was full of stumbles, missteps, and uncomfortable lessons. But she was willing to stay the course. She wasn't just apologizing anymore. She was taking responsibility for her actions and using them as a catalyst for growth. One afternoon, as Grace worked the floor, she couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt. The tension from months ago had dissipated, replaced by a sense of unity. The staff was friendly, not just to each other, but to every customer who walked through the door. Grace watched Samantha interact with a new family, greeting them with a smile that was genuine, her posture open and welcoming. The transformation was clear. Then, just as the dinner rush began to settle in, a familiar figure entered the restaurant. Jamal, Tasha, and Mia were back again. This time they were joined by a few friends, other black families from the community, all excited to try the food. The energy in the restaurant shifted as more and more people came in, all eager to experience the new atmosphere. Grace watched as Samantha approached their table with a warm smile, a stark contrast to the cold reception she had given them weeks earlier. "Good evening." "Welcome back," Samantha said, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm so glad to see you again. Can I get you started with some drinks?" Jamal smiled and nodded. "You know, we almost didn't come back after what happened last time, but something told us to give it another shot. I'm glad we did." Samantha's heart fluttered, and she felt a mix of gratitude and relief. She knew that actions spoke louder than words, and in this moment, her actions were speaking volumes. She was showing them that she had changed, that the restaurant had changed. As she turned to leave, Grace approached the table, standing tall with a proud smile. "I just wanted to thank you all for coming back. Your trust means everything to us." Tasha, who had been listening quietly, raised her glass in a small toast. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to the strength to do better." Everyone at the table nodded in agreement, and Grace felt a sense of warmth wash over her. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had chosen to take a stand, why she had insisted on making things right. The restaurant was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of redemption, of growth, and of the power of second chances.